So I was introduced to the Enneagram by my future wife in 1996. And when I first discovered the Enneagram, I thought it was a bunch of nonsense. It was horoscope-ish and so forth. I'd been working with the Myers-Briggs, so I understood typology. How many familiar with Myers-Briggs? Everybody's got that. You got the 16 types. With the Enneagram, we have 9 types, right? And when I first started working with it and going to a workshop that Judith recommended, I was very skeptical. And I read and read and read, and finally, I got it. It just hit me, and it was like somebody had been following me around all my life. And it uncovered patterns that I had been aware of, but that I had never been able to fully articulate. And it just became a very, very meaningful model for me in terms of my own personal development. And so since that time, over the last 20 years, I've used it extensively with clients to what I think is great effect. And so I'm excited about introducing this to you. And what I want to do is to begin with providing you with a context for this. What is this? Why use it? What's the context in coaching, right? So we're going to do 2 things, really. We're going to talk about your own personal development, and that's going to be the bulk of this. But at some point, we're going to talk about just briefly how this is used in your practice as an executive or life coach as well. So we're going to provide a context, and then I want to give you just a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to go through each of the types and have a descriptor, and maybe we'll have a dialogue for those who've kind of figured out what their type is. Then from there, we'll move on to looking at it from a coaching perspective, if you will. So that's what the plan is. I want to look at it in the context of personal change. When you emerge as an adult, there are certain strategies that you develop in order to be successful. And one of the things that we want to do is to create an awareness around what that strategy is. So the way I look at it is the first step, obviously, is to become conscious, become aware. We're on automatic pilot. 90%, 95% of how we behave is generated unconsciously, right? Through our autonomic nervous system and through the subconscious dynamics that occur. If any of you studied psychology at all, you certainly understand that, or done any spiritual work. As you move into adulthood, there are a couple of things that happen that develop this success strategy. One of them is that there's a certain personality dynamic that emerges in your, as a youngster, as a teen, that is generated 2 ways, I think: nature and nurture, right? So you have your DNA, you have what you were born with, your essence, if you will, and then you have the adaptive strategies that you've used to be able to get along in the world. And you put those together, and we'll make that as a construct for your personality. So your personality is part of that success strategy, some of which is not conscious. The other thing that is part of the success strategy is how you're awarded. So as you move into the workforce, even into school, but certainly beyond, into the workforce, your successes, your behavior generates certain kinds of successes, right? And that behavior then gets reinforced, and you develop kind of a way of being successful. Does that make sense? So do you know what your success strategy is? Do you really have a way? Can you articulate it? So an example, some people might have a success strategy of focusing on being able to help people, to be able to be of service to others. Others might have a success strategy of being the smartest person in the room, having all the knowledge, having the database, being an expert. Another person might have a success strategy that's really focused on achievement and being able to get things done and to being seen as successful, right? Another person might have a success strategy around being interpersonally dominant and being able to handle interpersonal dynamics in a way that is very forceful, right? Another example of a success strategy is someone who works very, very hard, is very diligent, and their primary focus is to make sure things go well, that nothing goes wrong. So they focus on making sure nothing goes wrong, and that's all the energy. Another example of a success strategy would be doing things right, doing things correctly, precisely, and doing things right. So those are some examples, and of course I'm coming from the Enneagram model, aren't I, around that, as I'm kind of ticking through the various numbers on the Enneagram wheel. So you have that, and at some level, you're not fully conscious of it completely. And so what happens is, and I've worked with executives on this, they have a certain way of doing things, and then and then they're successful, and then things stop working. They're not as successful. If they're highly dominant and aggressive, they have walking wounded all over the place. Or if they have to be very perfectionistic, they have a hard time delegating. So that success strategy at some point no longer works in particular circumstances. And they keep doing what they're doing, and sometimes crash and burn, right? So uncovering that, what I call deconstructing the success strategy, is certainly part of the challenge that you have in terms of personal change. And as a coach who is a navigator of change, of another individual's change, that can be something that's very, very helpful for the coach to facilitate. Well, how do you go about doing that? Well, how do you make somebody aware? Wake up, okay? Don't you realize what's happening to you, right? Well, one way to do that is, there are various tools. One is a 360 process in an organization where people are giving you feedback anonymously around your strengths and your weaknesses and what challenges you have. And that 360 can be an online assessment, or it can be interviews. I do quite a bit of interviewing of peers, bosses, and direct reports to get data. So 360 is one way. Another one is a personality assessment, and there are a number that are available. I mean, Ricardo mentioned there's several. I'm a senior consultant on Berkman. How many are familiar with Berkman? Most of you probably are. Berkman is a wonderful interactive personality inventory that measures normal individual differences. There's something called the Hogan. You have the Myers-Briggs. You have DISCs. You have a number of these very popular personality assessments that can provide some of that insight into what the dynamics are, right? Well, the Enneagram happens to be another one. This, to some extent, is going to be an infomercial around the Enneagram, because that's what our topic is today. But these other assessments are just wonderful. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to me that you can answer, a whole bunch of nutty questions on the Berkman, and you wonder they're never going to figure out me, with all these crazy questions. And then you get the report, and it just nails you. Have you had that experience? Yeah, it's magical to me. It really is. And certainly the Enneagram, which is kind of a different way of approaching it, is another way of doing it. And that's what we're going to, of course, drill in today. So the first step is to create that awareness, and then really acceptance. What works and what doesn't work. Okay, I'm very good at this, but man, I got to get better at this. And there has to be some level of awareness. Now, there's some times when people will say, and certainly as you get older, you can say, hey, I'm going to fix this in my next life. Okay, there's no way I'm going to fix this in this life, right? So you have to make a recognition that there needs to be a recognition that not only do you determine what works and what doesn't work, but also what you would really want to work on. So in that respect, you need to have a declaration to change. So there has to be a willingness and a gap between where you are now and where you'd like to be in order for you to initiate that change. And sometimes with coaches, and I'm mixing and matching here around talking about individual development and coaching, and I guess that's going to be okay. Later on, we're going to be talking more about your personal development as opposed to facilitating somebody else's development, right? There has to be a declaration and a willingness to change. And in my view, the coaching, some coaches meet with individuals and they just do what shows up with the individual. And it's more like, it's almost kind of a counseling or therapeutic model, right? They use all the coaching skills and so forth. Other coaches are very process oriented and they get into very, very detailed processes. And so there's a range there. My bias is toward being a little more process oriented, and that includes having a developmental plan. And I'm going to show you an example, just a little snippet of a developmental plan that is based on the Enneagram toward the end of the presentation. So now we need to be willing to spend the time and energy to be able to do the work. And doing the work is really important as a client to a coach, right? If I have a client who's not willing to do the work, then there's going to be a problem. And fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. Once I've gotten them engaged, I'm able to get them to be, embrace what they need to do and to do the work. And what does the work mean? Well, it means being self-reflective. It means practicing new behaviors. It means examining their belief systems. It means examining their assessments of themselves and other people. All kinds of things that an individual would need to do to, quote, do the work, right? But there has to be a willingness to take the time to do it. Take the time to do the reading and to really be reflective and think about things. So that's in this model, step number 4. And number 5 is a shift in beliefs and assessments. And I could give an hour presentation on shifts in, on beliefs and assessments. Ricardo could do the same. But if you're going to change behavior, more than likely there's going to need to be some level of shift in your belief system. And there's always this question, well, do I shift the belief system in order to change the behavior, or do I change the behavior in order to shift the belief system? And in my view, it's kind of a synergistic thing. It's a combination of both. Sometimes people don't get it until they practice. So they don't really know that they can be more powerful in interpersonal relations and in meetings and so forth until they actually have the risk. They move out of the comfort zone and they actually show up and do what they need to do to display more power behaviorally. And when they do that, they realize that, hey, my belief, I believe now that I can be powerful, right? So they're focusing on the belief before they really have, or focusing on the behavior before they have the belief. And other times you might have, wow, man, this huge insight, yabba dabba do, I did not realize this, and all of a sudden they really shift in their behavior just simply because of a paradigm shift. And sometimes the Enneagram will do that, and very, very fascinatingly so. So we're talking about new skills and behavior, and then ultimately coaching for consistent application with feedback systems in place. Now, I'm sure you've seen many different coaching models. This is one that I find to be very understandable, useful. It's one that has face validity, if you will, right? I'm going to show this one here. You've probably seen the iceberg metaphor around our behavior and around how much of our behavior is generated by subconscious dynamics. And I just today, there's a little website I have, and I read just the other day, somebody said, well, what the heck did Freud do? Freud, he was wrong about so many things. Well, one thing he wasn't wrong about was this whole idea of subconscious, which is really his I think, major contribution. That there's a whole lot going on that we don't know about. Does everybody get this? You certainly do, right? She just got out of graduate school, so in counseling. So here's a little more creative one, and you'll notice one thing that I think is really fascinating. Look at where decisions are. Decisions, we make decisions unconsciously and then we justify them to ourselves. So it's interesting, it's decisions, and then some decisions are conscious, right? But you notice where I put success strategy. We can articulate it, but not as well as we could articulate it if we had more self-awareness and more insight. So we're going to talk about the Enneagram, and working with the Berkman and the Myers-Briggs, and I'm familiar with the DISC, and I've done Hogan. What's the difference between the Enneagram and all these others, okay? More than these other instruments, it can measure this unconscious dynamics, these patterns, these underlying motivations that kind of drive our behavior. And so what happens is that many people, when they read the Enneagram, either their report or they study it enough to be able to read a chapter, and all of a sudden they read the chapter and they go, oh my God, this person has been following me around all my life. And I can quote a client from yesterday, and this fellow said, I know I was like this, but this is the first time that I had language to be able to really understand it and describe it. And that was over 2 different sessions he made that comment. He said, man, this is just amazing. It's like, it truly is like somebody's been Vulcan mind meld, following you around all your life. So it does provide those subconscious, unconscious dynamics. We've got these 9 types, and I'm going to explain in some briefly what all the arrows mean, all the lines at this point. But I want you to notice that there's an action center, there's a feeling center, and there's a thinking center. And that the 8, 9, and 1 are in the action center, and the 2, 3, and 4 are in the feeling, and the 5, 6, and 7 are in the thinking. The reason it's a circle is because there is something called wings, which means that if you have a dominant kind of center of gravity of your type, then the type on either side have influence on what your dynamic is. So I'm a 7, and so I have dynamics of the 8 as well as the 6. 9 would have dynamics of the 1 and the 8, and the 1, 9, and the 2, and so forth. So that's what they call wings. It's the number on either side of the number that you eventually kind of discover to be your type. We're just talking about the numbers on either side of your number. So for me, I have a 6 wing and I have an 8 wing. And my 6 wing is more dominant. And so if you've done your report, you can see that more than likely it will say which wing you have. And that's the dominant wing, although they're characteristics of the 6 wing. Right now, I'm a 7, and I am using my 8 wing to give this presentation. Because 8 wings are powerful. They have a powerful presence. They're able to really show up, so to speak. And that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm kind of using my 8 wing, right? Okay. Let's take a look at this triad, the centers of expression. And I'm not going to explain right now all these squirrely arrows going in and out. That's going to make it too complicated at this point. But I just want you to be aware that the action center types have issues with anger and control and their body. The feeling types, which is the 2, 3, and 4, shame and sadness and issues around feelings in the heart. The thinking center is the 5, 6, and 7, and their issues with fear and criticism and the head. And to some extent, one way of looking at it is that there's some level of... So the first way of looking at it is, if you're trying to discover your type, is, am I heart-based? Am I action-oriented? Or I'm in my head, or am I in my head all the time? So that would be one way of, the initial sort, if you will, as you're studying this. So there are many, many different charts that show the various mindsets of each type. I'm going to show you a couple of them. the idealized self. So as a 6, the mindset is I'm a loyal and responsible person. I'm dutiful. As a 1, I'm good and I do the right thing. I'm moral and I do the right thing. I do things correctly and morally. And it's really interesting because I do work in the prisons. And years ago, I was in a room with 80 guys. And they'd done the Enneagram. I didn't do it. I couldn't, just too much. But there was somebody else who did the Enneagram. And there are 80 guys in this room, and they're all inmates in the TDC, and there's 1-1. So if you're a 1, it's more than likely you're not going to end up in prison. Okay? So the 2, this ideal self-image is I'm helpful, I'm of service. The 3 is I'm successful, and I'm efficient, and I get things done, right? So each type has that idealized self-image. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that, and the reason it's kind of a challenge to type people, is that you're not looking at behavior exclusively, you're looking at the motivation behind the behavior. So 2 people can be behaving the same way and be different types because their motivational dynamics are quite different. For 7s, they're into experiencing. I want to have it all. It's called the epicure. In this case, we use the term enthusiastic visionary. And different Enneagram teachers use different terms for the numbers because some of them are copyrighted. And you'll see that on the variety of books that we have here. The numbers have different names. But the dynamics obviously are the same. So 4s, I have to be special. I had a conversation this morning with a client about, we got to the point, he's become quite familiar with the Enneagram, so he's typing one of his colleagues. He's a 5, and he determined that she was a 4. And when he read the chapter on 4 in one of these books, he said, man, that's it, that's her. I said, well, does she need to be special? Yeah. Is she creative? Yes. So we had the conversation about, being in relationship with her and how him knowing that she was a 4 and that he's a 5, okay, could be beneficial to him. Knowing that she's really functioning primarily on her feelings while he's Mr. Spock. So the point I'm making is, it's not necessarily the behavior, it's the motivation. Okay, how am I doing? Great. Everything's moving ahead? Okay, good. So let's go through these types. And what I'm going to do is I want you to timeshare with me. Go to the handout and look at the type as they talk about it. I'm just going to talk about my own personal experience with these types. And you can look at the handout, you can read the stuff that's on the overhead, and I'm not going to tell you a story about every one, but I figure I'm going to take just a couple of minutes on each type to give you a sense of timing. Maybe not even that. Okay. The 2, can I be of service? I'm of service. I'm helping you. I'm highly relational. Highly relational. There's a need for the 2 to sort of sort the world in terms of how they can be of service to another person. That's the good news. The bad news is if they're not appreciated, they get really pissed off. So 2s have a challenge around not. He's starting to laugh. Okay. 2s have a challenge about not being fully appreciated. They also have a challenge about not knowing really what they want. They know what you want, but they don't know what they want. And so there's a self-denial to some extent. Okay. Another example around 2s is because they're so relational. I'm going to give you an example where they stepped over boundaries. So I had a client who's a senior guy, a VP type, who turns out to be a 2, and he came into coaching because he was accused of sexual harassment. And after the first conversation with the guy, I'm saying, this guy is not an MCP, He's not a male chauvinist pig. He's not a seducer or, a destructive kind of guy. What's really going on here? Well, it turns out that he's just this big-time complimentary guy. So he's complimenting everybody on their shoes, on their appearance, and being nice, and he's a big guy, so sometimes he gets in their space, right? And there was a young woman, probably 25, 30, and this guy's 50, and he weighs about 300 pounds. There's a young woman, 25 years old, he just intimidated. He got too schmoozy with her, if you will. He didn't touch her. He didn't do anything, really, truly inappropriate, but it's in the eye of the perceiver, right? So she complained. And boy, he was just, laid out, on the carpet. But once he got that and we came up with rules around his behavior, problem solved. So the rest of the coaching assignment was to work on his leadership skills, right? The sexual harassment thing was like a no-brainer with him. So, but that's the dynamic with it too. They value attraction, and they're attracted to harmonious relationships, needs for others. They have a tendency to project their own needs on others. Here's some twos. Famous concerned helper personalities. I'm going to show you some examples of famous people on these various types. And these are this is speculation by people who are very knowledgeable about the Enneagram. There are a couple of them that I've come up with that I'm very confident about. But, I don't know Mother Teresa. Some people I've heard that some people said she was an 8, okay? But here she's a 2. And Reagan and Barbara Bush, okay? You notice they're not leaders. 2s generally are not leaders. They much prefer to support the leader. It's not, there are exceptions to that. But that's more than likely one of the dynamics for 2s. So here's a leader. Here's a competitive achiever, the 3. These people work, they're very ambitious, they're very competitive, they work hard to achieve. And do you know anybody who, every time you meet them, and I'm going to use a hard word here, but it's the best way I can describe it. They're the kind of people that they really have their shit together. They look good. They have their life together. They have a big home. They have a nice family. They drive a nice car. They're really sort of have this image of success. Those are 3s. And when you drive down Memorial Drive, those big houses, there's a greater percentage of 3s in those houses than the general population. Because they're generally focused on success. So that's the good news, all right? The challenge sometimes is they're masterful at spinning. So they can be deceptive. And one of these guys that I'm going to show you who's a 3, you'll see what we're talking about here. They can be deceptive at some level. They also have, and they can deceive themselves. They're not intentionally deceptive, but they can deceive themselves. One example is a 3 who had a company. He took over as CEO of the company. It was in bad shape, really bad shape. And the best he could do was to, after 2 years of just incredible effort, long story, he had to put it into bankruptcy. And he did, he put it in bankruptcy, and he was able to spin that. It was as not a failure. And very frankly, I agreed with him, okay? But you'd think, if you're CEO of the company went bankrupt, the guy was a failure? No. We hear him tell the story, he was a hero. And at some level, I think he was right. But there's a spin to it, isn't there? So that's one aspect of it, this deception. The other is that they have a tendency to be very focused on getting things done in task. And every once in a while, there's an example when I was working with Wright. There was one guy who was really funny. I'd be meeting with him, and all of a sudden he'd get up and run out the room. What the hell? I mean, there's no rapport. There's no goodbye. You've probably worked with people who are they're Energizer bunnies. There's no small talk. There's no relational kind of thing. They just get up and move, right? And the reason is they're focused on getting things done. They're focused on the task, right? So there's a relational dynamic that can be challenging. At the same time, they can be very charming because they want to look good. The 3s have a disconnected heart. So the 2s heart goes out to others. The 3s have a disconnected heart, and the 4s have an internal focus on their heart, so they're very deeply into their feelings. So let's take a look at this slide quickly. So blind spots, their own feelings, sometimes resulting in them deceiving themselves as to who they really are. I had one client who was a 3. I said, if you don't accomplish anything, who are you? He started crying. He was defining himself around his accomplishments, right? How big a house do you live in? He kind of looked at me sheepishly. 10,000 feet. Growth for you is not to get a bigger house. Okay, so there are your 3s. Slick-willed, right? Masterful at spinning, right? Masterful at a lot of other things from a leadership standpoint as an executive and as president as well. I'm not trying to be negative about him, other than just looking at the dynamics. Do you think Oprah is a competitive achiever? She's worth $1 billion. This guy's all about success, isn't he? So now we have the 4s, intense creative. 4s love being special, having a deep connection with their emotions. They're one of the few types that are really correlated to the dynamics of the Myers-Briggs. And that is, there are no 4s that are not Fs, that are not feelers. I mean, that's really a very part of who they are. So they go through the world feeling things. Their reality is around their feelings. They like to be special, be authentic, highly creative. One thing, and this is my own judgment around this, I'm not really sure whether I've read it, but my thinking is that 4s have a very strong opinions about artistic merit. Artistic merit. This is good, this is not good. This looks good, this sounds good, this does not look good, this sounds good. So being artists themselves, they have very strong opinions. My brother-in-law was a 4. This was many years ago with my first marriage. He comes into the house, and we have Muzak kind of stuff on the radio. He says, "Why are you listening to that crap?" You know, because he was a jazz guy. You know, I mean, I had another client who was in advertising, and he would be going down the road, listening to a radio commercial, getting pissed off because it was a lousy commercial. It didn't meet his standards of creativity. So 4s have a hard time manifesting things. Things happen because they just sort of flow and emerge. And they're not linear in how they go about getting things done. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of 4s, and this is really interesting. This is where I might have somebody debate me, but I can make a strong case. Okay, here are some 4s. Now, you can see, you know, creative, intense creative. Prince, right? Bob Dylan, Jim Morrison, musicians all, right? But then we have Steve Jobs there. What's that about? There are not too many CEOs who are 4s, I'll tell you that. But if you read the biography of Steve Jobs, the one thing I came away with is that his self-identity was as an artist, as a creator. So my take on it is he was a 4 with a very strong competitive achiever wing, with a very strong 3 wing. Does that make sense? So I have not seen anybody type Steve Jobs. I've had a couple of debates with people online, but that's my take on it. 5s, the quiet specialist, private, cerebral, trying objectively to understand the world, to explore concepts and acquire in-depth knowledge. My son is a 5. 5s need a lot of downtime. They need time by themselves. They have a hard time showing their ignorance. So they're going to do the research themselves before, and they want to come out as the expert. So my classic example with my son is, hey man, I met this guy who's a fantastic professional photographer. Maybe you want to talk to him and learn something. Nope. He got no interest. He's not going to seek advice from somebody else. He's the one that's knowledgeable. You want to learn about photography, he'll figure it out himself. So, programmers are fives, researchers, college professors, making sense of the world, conserving resources, avoiding dependence, pursuit of knowledge, minimalists. Put a 5 and a 4 together, and I have a good friends of mine, a couple who are a 5 and a 4. She's a 4 and he's a 5. This guy is a minimalist, you know, and he's totally disorganized. And she is an artistic. Everything has to look good, has to, you know, be very pretty and so forth, and be organized. Well, they've had their challenges, but understanding and learning. Retreating into a cave. Stressed they retreat to a cave. Absolutely. I had a conversation with my son today. He is totally stressed out. Lives in New York. He's a 5. He's got 3 kids. He's got a job. He's trying to get a mortgage for an apartment. I mean, he's just in total overwhelm. And the only way that he's managing that is meditating. Meditating is being very helpful for him. But 5s have a real challenge about being in uptime. I have another client that is a 5 who's a manager. He's an operations manager. We figured out that, you know, he's in a retail business. He has to be out front with customers and with employees, but he needs back office time, big time. So we're trying to carve out time for him to be in the back office to be able to decompress. But when he's out front and leading, he really leads effectively. So here's some 5s. And, you know, I apologize for not having many women on these slides. I went through a lot of work trying to find women in various types, but it's very hard. I mean, who the hell knows what Meryl Streep's type is? She's a chameleon, right? You know, if you don't know people personally, it's very hard unless they have, you know, a real public persona, like a politician or, you know, a celebrity that is out there. And I'll show you another celebrity that's, I mean, this guy is, hang him on the wall. He's a 7. I mean, you could frame the guy. He's a 7, right? 6s. 6s, they're the ones that make sure things go well, don't go wrong. They're like the little engine that could. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. They have self-doubt in the midst of really getting it done. They're very dutiful. They work hard. You want to get a event planner, a wedding planner, get a 6. They will make sure everything works well. They're very good operationally. Very aware of threats. They have a hypervigilance. They're fear-based. The 5, 6, and 7 are fear-based. Anxious, loyal, cautious, alert. My wife is a 6. She's wonderful. Love 6s. But she's hypervigilant. She's got a master's. She's a black belt in Taekwondo. So if we were out and we ever got attacked, you know, first of all, she'd know they were coming before I did, and then she'd take them out. Okay, so make things safer and more secure. Become more and more indecisive and worrisome. 6s have trouble in their self-critiquing so much around the self-doubt that they have a hard time really being spontaneous. So giving a presentation, for instance, like this, a 6 would be extremely prepared. If they have to get very, very comfortable with the material to be able to really be effective. 6s, fake it till you make it, no way. Another challenge for 6s is that because they want to make sure things go wrong, avoid things going wrong, they have a hard time delegating and trusting other people. I had one guy who was an operations manager who had, you know, he was the hub of everything. He was in manufacturing. I mean, nothing happened without his involvement. And that's not good, you know, right, if you're a manager? And so as a consequence, that's one of the things we worked on is have him offload stuff and really trust people to get things done and not have to be the quality control manager of everything, right? Okay, I thought this was really interesting. Julia Roberts and Adolf Hitler on the same page. What the hell is that about, right? And I think this is a good illustration of the fact that each type has their own pathology. All types can be crazy and mentally ill, right? Or they can be mentally healthy. One of these books the Rizzo book has a levels of development page. And that level of development page for each type, you can look at that and you can kind of see where you are on your level of development, and which is really wonderful because it gives you a path of your development. So not only can you look at other places where you can develop, you can look at that. And when I say other places, we'll talk about that in a minute. So you have folks who are, effective leaders, but pathological to some extent, right?
Skill sets for each.
Yes, right. And so there's no moral component. I did say, ones are goody two shoes at some extent, and they do have this focus on morality at some level, but that's minor. I mean, Jimmy Swaggart is a one. Remember Jimmy Swaggart? He's a evangelist. Many of these guys who are Laura Schlesinger, some of these guys, Laura Ingram, and some of these personalities that some of them old, some of them currently, but they come across as very righteous, and righteousness is a big thing, but somehow there's a trap door where they get themselves in big trouble. I think John Edwards might be a one. Remember John Edwards? No. Okay, well, I won't get into that. Okay, so, but they don't end up in jail, at least that many. Okay, so, okay, sevens. Optimistic, looking for a good time. I know when I'm talking to somebody, if they use the word fun in a conversation, within 3 or 4 minutes, they've used the word fun a couple of times, they're a 7, okay? That's one of the ways they sort. And spontaneous, keen, uninhibited. I'm a 7, but I'm kind of a dampered down 7. I'm a self-preservation 7, and I'm not going to get into subtypes because that just adds to the complexity. But there's some subtypes, there are 3 of them for each type. They're kind of a counter type. So I'm a 7, but I have much more of a 6 wing. So I'm not like Robin Williams, who's a 7, right? The thing that was the most insightful for me was the avoidance of pain. When I read this stuff and I looked at my life and how I'd led my life for the previous 45 years when I first started learning this stuff, it was just amazing to me. How the various times in my life where I escaped situations or anticipated situations that were going to cause me suffering, and I figured out a way to avoid it. The avoidance of pain is one of the things. I remember one time meeting a guy. He said, "I'm going to a workshop this weekend on suffering." And I said, "You got to be nuts! Why in the world would anybody go to a workshop on suffering?" This is before I knew the Enneagram. Well, now I understand that that's my paradigm. I don't suffer. I'm okay, right? When suffering is part of life. So pain is optional. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional, right? And 7s do have a challenge around staying focused and being detail-oriented. And I have another client who's 7. My God, he's just a real challenge in staying focused. Very, very loquacious and thinks that just talking about stuff is going to make things happen. So here's some 7s, okay? Fallon, hang him on the wall, he's a 7. There's no doubt about it. Steven Spielberg, here's a leader. Both of these guys are leaders. Spielberg is worth $1 billion. He leads very effectively. And of course, Branson is a master entrepreneur. 8, assertive, direct, decisive. These are people they come into the room, you know it. They generally have a big presence. They're either bulky, not always, certainly the men particularly. They're bulky, and they have a very strong presence. They have no problem with conflict. They are warriors. They have a warrior mentality, and the warrior mentality is designed to protect the hurt little boy inside. So I remember meeting a CEO of a company a number of years ago, and the guy liked to bang his hand on the table. And you know, he was very, very forceful and directive, and banging his hand on his table to intimidate the hell out of everybody. Okay, well, he's protecting himself by doing that, isn't he? So I must be strong. I must be in control. Eights know the right thing to do all the time, and that's a real challenge, because if you work for an 8 and you go in and say, I want to do this, they say, no, we're going to do this. And you come in and say, I want to do this, and they say, no, we're going to do this. Eventually, you're not going to be coming in there making suggestions anymore, right? So 8s have a couple of challenges. One is they know the right thing to do, so they sort of suck the air out of their subordinates in terms of the subordinates bringing in their vision or their value, right? And the other thing is they can move into a warrior mentality and not have any empathy. And that can be very challenging. So the path for them, and we'll talk about this, is to move toward empathy. So the world's attacking them. They do not respect weakness. They will lose respect for you. And if you fight them, they're going to fight back, big time. Defense mechanism, denial. Stress, they become more aggressive and controlling. They can believe that the world is just and will support them, relaxed, all right? But the other thing that happens with 8 sometimes is they just withdraw. They just go hide. But generally, pretty forceful dudes. Here's your 8s. Does that seem like active controller personalities? Now, I'm typing Michelle Obama, and the one thing that I know that is helping me do that is that her husband is on the next slide. He's a 9. And many times people marry their wings. Now, not all the time. And if your spouse is not a wing, don't throw them out the door. But at the same time, you would be, I'm surprised at the number of times we marry our wings. And so I'm saying that, and also Michelle Obama has a very strong presence. I don't think she's a 3. I think she has a strong presence, and she has the physicality of someone who's an 8. So that's the reason I'm suggesting she's probably an 8. Now, if you look at the functionality around the levels of development, you'll discover when you read them that Trump, I'm not talking about politically, I don't want to get into politics, but Trump is on the borderline between unhealthy and healthy. He's on a scale of 1 to 9, he is a 5, a 4 or 5, 1 being totally pathological, okay? And when you read that descriptor, I mean, regardless of what political persuasion you are, you can agree with that descriptor. Okay, adaptive peacemaker. These guys are wonderful. They're good looking. They're just right, Ken?
Checks in the mail.
Okay. So, the adaptive peacemaker, the easygoing, non-aggressive, accommodating. They have a tendency to not be invisible, but not show up, particularly at an unhealthy level, in a powerful way. They have a hard time with conflict, being in conflict. They love mediating. They're a peacemaker. They want things to go well between people. So promoting harmony and peace, getting input from others, creating comfort routines and avoiding conflict, easygoing, have a tendency to procrastinate, have a tendency to be passive-aggressive, hard time saying no. So they won't say no, but at the same time they won't do it. And leaders can be, 9s can be very effective. What did you say?
Whatever you said.
That's right, yeah. Go along to get along. So look at this. This is interesting. We've got 4 presidents who are who are 9s, probably others. So it's very much of a leadership thing. George Washington was a 9. I've read his biography, 2 or 3 biographies. I'm pretty sure he's a 9 with a 1 wing. Eisenhower, I picked Eisenhower. Eisenhower was picked to run the Allied forces because he was a mediator. He was able to bring people together and to bring all the constituencies in the Allied countries together in order to be effective, right? So healthy 9s can be very, very effective leaders. One more, strict perfectionist. Conscientious, must be perfect, cannot make mistakes. Conscientious, fine-tuning things is very, editing, that kind of thing. Rule-based, reforming society, having a bigger picture to reform the world can be part of being a 1. They can work very, very hard, very, very diligent workers. I think the 2s and the 1s are the hardest workers. And then here's some 1s. Miss Manners, Mrs. Thatcher, Hillary Clinton, Gandhi's a reformer. So let's talk a little bit about the path forward here. The Enneagram training in Chicago, and it is a wonderful tool to help people get to their type. It's the first one I've found that has just such a high level of validity, and you get a lot of information around the centers of expression, your type, strengths and weaknesses. You can see here that 20-page report, which is a $45 report, has a lot of information in it, including stress dynamics, which is kind of an extra benefit, if you will. So there's a lot to work with. And then when you go to the leadership report, what I call the leadership report, not only do you get the information from the basic report, but you have leadership dynamics around communication and dealing with conflict, decision making, team behavior, and so forth. So it's just an incredibly rich tool for coaching. And I want to give you, let's see, we have just a few more minutes. Well, let me finish up here, and then I'm going to respond to questions. So this is what a developmental might look like. So here's an individual who has a core dynamics of a 5, right? So one of the models I use in terms of developmental planning is current state or behavior, desired state or behavior, right? And then action plans associated with making that shift. This is one of probably 6 or 7 pages of material that we've generated with this client from a developmental standpoint. So if the client is willing and they want to go through the process, it can be very, very rich around this. So in this case, he's a 5. He's not taking a sufficient amount of private time. He needs to delegate others to do the firing line stuff, and be able to increase his leadership skills in delegating and motivating. So, as I say, this is just the top page of one of 4 or 5 pages. So, so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and close. Yes. Uh-huh.
On either side of each of the type, there's some different.
Your wings, right? Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in the feeling wing that there was one that was attached from the heart, connected to the heart. How do those things kind of fit in around where the wings land?
Well, if you, on the feeling, what type are you?
I'm a 9.
A 9. Okay, so that's in the action center. All right. The 8, 9, and 1 are the action center types. Okay. Let's talk about one dynamic. That's anger. Okay. Anger for an 8 is expressed externally, right? You're an 8. Can you identify with that? Yeah. And anger for a 1, you're a 1, is self-directed. I'm not good enough. I'm not, I'm not meeting my standards, and I'm upset about it. I mean, to the point where my standards are so high, I'll never meet them, so I'll never be successful. Right? So I'm angry about that. So there's an internal anger. Okay. For the 9, there's a forgetting of the anger. So more than likely, you would be disconnected from that part of you that is angry, that can be angry, right? And as a consequence, you're also disconnected from your body, if you will. So that's where the disconnect. For the 5, 6, and 7, the 6 is disconnected because they have crazy thinking. They do a lot of mind reading. They do a lot of obsessing about their thinking that's flawed. For the 2, 3, and 4, the feeling, the heart, for the 2 is external. For the 3, they're disconnected from their heart, and for the 4, it's internal, right? So I hope that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
The middle one is detached, and then the right.
Okay, good. Thanks.